Sky satellite network is now transmitting 4 channels into Britain, doubling the previous number. But it's the controversial issue of his dominance of media ownership which is set to flare again in Australia. Later this week, an international conference in Sydney. The topic, in a word, Murdoch. Titled News Unlimited, the conference will analyse the impact of Rupert Murdoch's global media empire. A great deal of interest will centre on Adelaide, where Murdoch now owns all the print media except the afternoon daily, The News. Ironically, The News was once the only paper Murdoch owned. Well, 2 years after wresting control of the giant Herald and Weekly Times group, questions persist about Murdoch's control of the press in South Australia. Reporter Mark McEwen, formerly a senior writer with The Advertiser, reveals the extraordinary conditions associated with the sale of The News and the extent of the commercial links it retains with Murdoch's News Limited.
When Rupert Murdoch pulled off Australia's biggest ever corporate takeover in 1986, paying $2 billion for the huge Herald and Weekly Times media group, he became, briefly, South Australia's only press proprietor. He owned the lot: The Advertiser, The News, The Sunday Mail, the Messenger papers and the national daily, The Australian. But this was clearly in breach of provisions of the Trade Practices Act governing market dominance and monopolies. Murdoch was told he'd have to divest, to sell off one of the daily newspapers. He opted to sell The News, his first newspaper, sometimes called the cradle of his global media empire. The News, it appeared, became South Australia's only independent daily newspaper. Or did it? 2 years after the legally required divestment, questions are still being asked about the News's independence, or conversely, its dependence on Murdoch. The Trade Practices Commission, the only regulatory body with any influence over the press in Australia, is now completing a report for the Federal Communications Minister, Mr. Willis, on whether Murdoch has complied with its divestment requirements. Some people believe he hasn't, that in South Australia, Murdoch retains a de facto monopoly in the print medium.
There seems to me to be evidence that Murdoch's indirect involvement in the afternoon paper, the Adelaide News, is tantamount to there being some sort of a de facto or covert monopoly.
He has virtually a monopoly in the suburban and regional newspapers. He has, with the exception of the Financial Review, a direct or indirect influence on all of the other newspapers that circulate in South Australia.
I think the biggest question that South Australians have to consider is whether they like being a one newspaper owner state, because despite the surface arrangements between the Adelaide Advertiser and the Adelaide News, there's no question in my mind that the News Corporation, Rupert Murdoch's company, has at least the potential to control newspapers in that state.
The reasons for such misgivings go beyond appearances. They have their genesis in the complex financial wheeling and dealing that went on in the wake of the Herald and Weekly Times takeover, and in the unusual commercial arrangements that Murdoch has made with The News, supposedly his opposition in South Australia. The history in simplified form and dealing only with South Australia goes like this. When Murdoch bought the Herald and Weekly Times, he was obliged to sell The News. The buyer was a northern New South Wales-based group, Northern Star Holdings, in which incidentally Murdoch retains a 15% share. Northern Star was mainly interested in getting its hands on some of Murdoch's television properties and agreed to take The News, but only at a price. Northern Star negotiated an extraordinary deal for itself in which Murdoch provided indemnities against losses and a concession called a put option, which meant it could, literally, put the properties back to Murdoch after a set time if it decided it was unprofitable. In effect, Murdoch was setting up Northern Star as owners of The News to comply with the letter of the law, but many people, including the Trade Practices Commission, were sceptical about whether he was complying with the spirit of the law. Their scepticism increased as the deal took on further complications. Northern Star decided to bail out of its newspaper properties to pursue television interests. It needed a buyer for The News. It found one in The News's long-time Murdoch editor, Roger Holden.
I now have to compete in the Adelaide marketplace against a very formidable and a very talented opponent. That certainly leaves me a little subdued, I must admit.
Holden may have been subdued at the prospect of competing with Murdoch, but he must have been elated at the terms of the contest. Finding out what those terms were meant chasing a paper trail that was often a dead end. This documentation of the sale of the news to Roger Holden, which is publicly accessible, gives very little insight into the complex financial deals that were done between him and Northern Star Holdings and ultimately Rupert Murdoch's News Limited. But sources at the Trade Practices and Corporate Affairs Commissions and journalists, particularly two Sydney Morning Herald journalists, Colleen Ryan and Andrew Keenan, have helped unravel the paper puzzle. Holden, in fact, inherited a very similar deal to the one Murdoch had done with Northern Star. He bought only the masthead, and with it came the paper's journalists and advertising staff. Murdoch retained ownership of the news building, the printing presses and the distribution system. Finance for the deal was arranged by Northern Star. Holden, in turn, was indemnified against losses, and the put option meant he could bail out after 5 years with no chance of losing out financially. Holden had not sought out media magnate status. It had been thrust upon him, gift-wrapped. Within a few months, the News had moved from its North Terrace premises into the Advertiser building, where it now shares production facilities and the editorial library with the Murdoch papers printed from there. The Advertiser, the Sunday Mail, the Messenger papers and the Australian. Karen Jennings, lecturer in Communication Studies at the McGill campus of the South Australian College of Advanced Education, believes Murdoch's commercial arrangements with the News are a serious barrier to the paper's independence.
I would go further than saying it's non-competitive. I think it's a dependent arrangement. The fact the News is dependent for its day-to-day operations, for its financial viability, for its security, in fact, on this very convenient arrangement with Murdoch's News Limited.
The managing editor of the Advertiser, David Smith, appointed by Murdoch shortly after the Herald and Weekly Times takeover, was unequivocal on whether Murdoch had a monopoly in South Australia.
I can assure you he does not.
Despite appearances?
If that is the appearance, it is not the fact. I speak from the position of one who is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the Advertiser and the Sunday Mail. And I know that it's a highly competitive market. I'd be happy to elaborate on that for you. But I know that there is no Murdoch influence into the News. If that's the inference in the question, the answer is a flat no.
And Smith's new editor, Piers Ackerman, says competition between newspapers in Adelaide is very real.
I regard it as serious as competition between newspapers in any city I've worked in.
But plans by Murdoch and the News to consolidate their commercial operations in a huge new complex at Mile End, where all newspapers will be produced as of next year, further encourage scepticism. Sites like this fuel speculation about Murdoch's dominance of the press in South Australia. But appearances can be deceiving. At the heart of the debate about the extent of Murdoch's influence are questions such as, should he be allowed to establish joint facilities and close commercial ties with other newspapers, as he's done in South Australia, without a clear legislative framework to protect that paper's independence? Or do we accept that deals done with bodies such as the Trade Practices Commission are an adequate safeguard of the public interest?
The question is whether South Australians are comfortable with the fact that influence may be exercised whenever Rupert Murdoch's corporation chooses. Can you risk waiting for that time?
Paul Chadwick is a former investigative reporter for The Age and has just written a book on media ownership in Australia. He also lectures in media law at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. During the Herald and Weekly Times takeover, he formed a group called Free the Media. Isn't it reasonable to accept that papers can have those sort of commercial arrangements but stay independent of each other?
It's all based on trust. Should people trust anyone, not Rupert Murdoch, anyone with that much power? Is it sensible, given what's at stake, especially where you're dealing with the major papers in a state, state political issues, those sorts of things, is it sensible for people to say, okay, we will trust this owner to have, in effect, control of all the daily papers, and they seem like they won't abuse that power, so we'll take the punt. I don't think that that's a sensible risk for any democratic society to take. Dominance of the press is an important power, and it's not one you give lightly to anybody. It's not a question of whether or not they're trustworthy. The point is you just don't do it. Even if Mother Teresa owned as many papers as Rupert Murdoch does in Australia, I wouldn't be comfortable.
Ian McPhee, the Federal Coalition's former communications spokesman, sacked by John Howard for, amongst other things, his trenchant criticism of the Herald and Weekly Times takeover and the opposition's acquiescence, will be one of the key speakers at this week's News Unlimited conference in Sydney.
There is a great and widespread belief in the community that News Limited is a front for Murdoch, that it was bought by people who didn't obviously have the capital, who didn't make any public bids for it, who were in-house employees of Murdoch's. Many joint arrangements have been negotiated between the two of them, which I think at least raises the question whether there is a genuine break-up of the Murdoch empire in South Australia at all. Now, the Trade Practices Commission has been exploring that, but has complained that it hasn't got adequate resources to be satisfied that it can do its job properly, and the government has no intention of providing resources for it.
If we had something to hide, which we don't, the Trade Practices Commission has already been in here, literally been through this building. We have nothing to hide. We welcome them to come and talk with us at any stage. The Trade Practices Commission is the watchdog in this case of a commercial arrangement.
But are the financial deals between Rupert Murdoch, Northern Star Holdings and Roger Holden a matter of public interest that should be pursued by a newspaper such as The Advertiser, regardless of the self-interest of the proprietor?
No, I don't agree with that.
So, where is your first loyalty as a journalist?
My first loyalty is to the production and the day-to-day operations of The Advertiser and the Sunday Mail.
Is your loyalty to your employer or to the reading public?
My loyalty is to my employer. My responsibility is to the reader.
And if your responsibility to the reader is in conflict with your loyalty to your employer, where's your priority?
I don't have a problem with there is no conflict.
That report from Mike McEwen, compiled, might I say, without the assistance of the News. Managing editor Roger Holden declined to be interviewed and refused to let us film inside the News or speak with any of its staff.